We're on session 3 of the Stop D program, all about healthy eating. We do these recordings for training purposes and makeup classes, though they never replace a real class. So we hope that you will join. We're going to go through the material. Remember, this is a part 3 of really a 3-part nutrition session. I'd say we have session 2, which we did last week, all about nutrition, fat, sodium, calories, reading nutrition labels. We talked about volumetrics. We also have the meds workshop, the particular one on the diet workshop. And then we have this class. So this is, I'd say, part 3. We do a follow-up first. And this takes a while. We get to know everybody, share meal ideas, recipes, inspire each other, hear about how the week has been. And then I typically do a poll. Which of the following best describes your nutrition literacy? That means how confident are you about your nutrition knowledge? And I ask these questions, either I'm confused, I'm fairly confident about healthy foods, I know how to prepare them, I know a lot, but applying is so challenging, or I'm very confident in what to eat and how to eat. And you know what we find when we do these, people are on a pretty huge, big spectrum, and usually I have one of almost everything, but I rarely have very many of I'm confused about which foods are healthy or good for me. And I think that's a good thing to point out, is to remember that most of us already do have a lot of knowledge in this area, but of course there are some areas where there's just so much controversy and contradiction with nutrition. So one of the hopes is that we clear it up, but also this program can support people to eat in many different ways. Again, we have people who are vegetarian, we have people who are not vegetarian, some people eat very low carb and more paleo style, and some
1
people,
minute, Erica. I'll come.
okay, do more like, hopefully like the plate method and very balanced as we recommend, and but we will support you in many different ways of eating. So before we talk about what to eat, we spend a little time talking about how to eat and the way we eat. And we talk about routines. The body really responds well to routines. And there have been a lot of studies, actually research on consistency. And consistency studies have to do with people do better health-wise, blood sugar management, weight management, when they're more consistent in eating habits, not only on the weekdays, but also on the weekends. Not only on the weekends and weekdays, but also a little bit when they go on vacations and holidays. There's a little bit of consistency in eating patterns. And so consistency can be really crucial. And one of the things, you know, I usually like to single somebody out in class and say, who already does this? In a group of about 15 people, there's usually 1 or 2 people who will say, that's me, I'm very routine. I eat every morning, you know, at 8 in the morning, lunch is between 1 and 2, dinner is at this time. We also talk about there's no one right way of eating, as I mentioned, and that many different eating patterns can support people. So, you know, the Mediterranean diet, there can be a healthy South Asian diet, a healthy, you know, more Western diet. I mean, a combination. A lot of people are doing intermittent fasting. It's almost a trend now. And that can work very well for some people, but it doesn't work for all people. And so we really are looking individually for what's right for you. But it's really helpful to eat in routine. As much as we can, our body responds really well to routine. So I just really like to take a little time to talk to people about routines, and that's a nice place to focus. I often ask people what's the difference between skipping breakfast versus intermittent fasting. That's just an interesting conversation to have, but I won't go into it. You'll have to come to the class to see the answer. How you eat, we also talk about mindful eating, and we have a whole session on this that we'll do together, and I think we've done already as coaches, so it's similar to what you've seen before, but new material to this class. And you know, a little preview is how you eat might be just as important as what you eat. So one idea is eat slowly, as I believe Gandhi said. chew your drink and drink your food. Is that what he said?
Ah,
And so one of the things, why do we eat slowly? Because it takes the brain about 20 minutes to get that message of fullness from the stomach. Most of all of us have heard that saying, which has a lot of truth. And so that's one method we can do. We can also learn to be more present and savor every single bite. And why is it important to eat mindfully? It can improve digestion, since digestion begins with the saliva enzymes in the mouth. It can help reduce overeating. It can improve the experience by far of eating. We love to eat, don't we? It's a wonderful experience. And so eating mindfully can be a very, very important habit. And many people in this very class say, the plate method transformed them, volumetrics transformed them. And I'll hear at least a few people in this year-long program say it was mindful eating for me. I now eat much more mindfully. And so we will explore that in detail. But that's one thing that you can begin to do right now, is take more time, eat more mindfully, and see where that leads you starting today. So then we talk about overall eating patterns. And I don't think it, just like I asked you in the beginning about the poll, how's your nutrition literacy? I never think this is a big surprise to anybody saying, we recommend, these are the MyPlate guidelines from the USDA, but they're good. Eating veggies, a lot of them. Make half of your plate veggies. Eat fruit, and we're not talking about dried fruit or fruit juice. We're talking about fresh, whole fruits. We recommend whole grains, and MyPlate says make half of your grains whole grains. Lean proteins, not the overly fatty marbled meat proteins, but plant-based. Legumes, or if you eat meat, then chicken and fish are more recommended, and the healthier fats, which we will talk about today. Today we'll get deeper into what are monounsaturated fats and what are omega-3 fatty acids that everybody's heard so much about. And no surprise that we also say eat less of added sugar, sodium, restaurant foods, because it has so much of all of these things, refined grains like the white flour, and saturated fats and trans fats. So that is the recommendations. And Harvard Plate also made a, I guess, less political and similar type plate as the USDA. They removed dairy, saying, you can get calcium from other sources. It's a good source, but it doesn't have to be on your plate. And they replaced it with water. And they say, go a little sparingly, not too crazy on milk, and ideally water, tea, or coffee without sugar. And you see here mostly half the plate vegetables, or vegetables and fruit in this case, and they're just a little more specific. Again, they get into eat fish or poultry or beans, but limit red meat, limit cheese, avoid bacon, pretty strong language, processed meats, etc. Look at brown rice and quinoa and whole grains as opposed to white rice and white bread. So no surprises. And they also say, hey, look, more veggies is better, but don't consider a potato or French fry vegetable, which is news to some people. Where would we put the potatoes? Right there.
Grains. Yeah.
Yeah, very good. And they say, hey, oils are okay, but use ones that are limited in saturated fats. So they say limit butter, avoid trans fats, which we'll talk about, and choose healthier oils such as olive oil. And then here's the South Asian Heart Center recommendation and philosophy, which is that we encourage high fiber, plant-based meals and limited consumption of refined carbohydrates, animal fats, and processed foods, and discourages sweet beverages and fried snacks. That's a mouthful, but pretty reasonable, right? And then as, well, neither of you said, but I think you'll know that many people in this class will pick C from that poll of saying, hey, I knew all of this, but applying is so difficult. And I know you both coach, so you both work with people who say, I knew this, but how do I apply it? And so that's what That's what we work on all year is, this is a beautiful model, but not all of our plates exactly look like this, obviously. Sometimes the food is put together, and how do we figure out, how do we keep adding more of the non-starchy vegetables and get more of our plates looking like they have these components? And remember, we talked about last week that 9-inch plate was a really nice model. And then there's Michael Pollan. Have you heard of him? He's really a food journalist. He's really interesting. He wrote a few books called Omnivore's Dilemma, is pretty well known. And he wrote this one called Eat Food, Not Too Much, and Mostly Plants. That's the title. I believe that's the title. And he has these 7 words and 7 rules. And I love it. And I think it helps, I don't know, clarify a lot. He just says, don't eat anything your great grandmother wouldn't recognize as food. Don't eat anything with more than 5 ingredients or ingredients you cannot pronounce. Stay out of the middle of the supermarket. That has to do with all the good things around the periphery. If you think, well, not the bakery, but the fruits and vegetables, and there maybe you'll have your dairy and produce, but you'll have the fresh things, and what's in the middle? A lot of the processed, the cookies, the chips. Don't eat anything that won't eventually rot. These are great rules. And it's not what you eat, but how you eat. We just talked about that. Enjoy meals with the people you love. I mean, that's really profound. And don't buy food where you buy your gasoline. They're just kind of beautiful thoughts. And what I like to remind people of, this picture, there's a saying, many of you may know it, but it's an expression, don't lose the forest for the trees. And it's that sometimes we get so boggled down by the details, we forget the simplicity. We were born knowing this stuff. And that's why so many people are so confused. Like, well, is it better to have non-fat or full fat milk? And we'll get into that. Should I eat carob or dark chocolate instead of that? Is it okay to have red wine, and how much? And we have so many sort of food controversies. I like to kind of broaden the perspective and say, actually, we know a lot more than we think, right? You just saying yes, that it's not such a mystery how to stay healthy. And we eat as a society a lot more processed foods. We're opening bags and grabbing these things that were made in factories. Of course, those are the culprits that aren't as good for our health. And if it's fresh and it will eventually rot, that's what it means. Those foods are better for us. So it's hopefully not a huge mystery. And then I usually do a stretch break. And so we look at the different sources of carbohydrates, protein, and fat. And sometimes people eat very low carbohydrate, keto, the paleo diet, and sometimes people don't know. If you really look at, well, what are the carbohydrate sources? People may think of these ones over here, and bread and grains and pastries, but sometimes we forget, well, also starchy vegetables like corn, like we talked about, potatoes, but also the whole grains, and also legumes have carbohydrate, also fresh fruit and things with a lot of vitamins and nutrients, and even dairy, all dairy. So when people say I'm completely eliminating carbohydrate, only eating fat and protein, I mean, quite honestly, it's a pretty hard thing to do sustainably. And typically it was said many years ago that for most people, it makes up about 45 to 65% of our diets, this type of food. Now, if we look at it, we want to be able to recognize, well, what are the better sources? We recommend the whole intact grains, quinoa, oats, brown rice, farro is an interesting one. It could be tortillas or rotis and whole grain pasta. There's even, we can make our idli and dosa with whole grain. We can make khichdi with whole grain. And then there's the starchy vegetables, which we have, most of them listed here: peas, sweet potatoes, and pumpkin squash and acorn squash, so the winter squashes. And what we want to think here when we think of that half plate vegetable, this is our quarter of the plate, any of these things. And then we go into protein. Ideally, 10 to 35% of a person's diet. It's a pretty wide range. 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight is more ideal. Sometimes I will individualize when people say, well, what are my protein needs? And they're tracking with one of these apps like MyFitnessPal. And most people can recognize the recommendable ones. I know you can. We'll recommend, of course, any of these beautiful legumes, the nuts, the seeds, and the eggs or the poultry or the fish. But these are also in the protein category, and we say, whoa, 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 be careful, go easy, a little caution light on these types. Tofu is okay, it's a good source. So we say beans, legumes, dairy, soy, tofu, eggs, seafood, all of these are good sources of protein. Do some of them have carbohydrate too? Yes. See, everything isn't isolated or lives in a bubble. And then we talk about fat. And we go into this a little more extensively. And I know you can recognize here the good sources and what we recommend.
Erica?
Yes, Shubha, yes.
So you said 1 to 1.2 grams protein for 1 kg of body weight?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, actually, ideally, it is even 0.8 to 1.2 grams per kilogram.
Okay.
And all of these, some people will argue, you know, if they're real like weightlifters or doing a lot of resistance training and such, some people will argue as much as 1.5 grams per kilogram, but that's a lot of, if you figure out if you know your weight in kilograms, for
Okay.
those who don't know it, you divide by 2.2 from pounds.
Yeah.
You'll see that that's getting pretty high up there. If an egg equals 7 grams, and you might get 7 grams from, you know, half a cup of these. It takes a while to add up. And fat, typically, I would say 20 to 35% of a total diet. These can all be individualized nowadays. There's no like one recommendation for all people. And again, it's more about the type of fat and not just the total fat. This program focuses on fat to a degree, but I always say it's a moderate amount. And you know what? They've put people's goals at 25% fat. It's a very moderate, it's very reasonable, I would say. And many people can go up, you know, if they do like to go lower carbohydrate and higher fat and protein, you have to be careful you're not like overdoing your body on too much protein and too much fat also, because that can end up having other issues. Some people will go up to maybe 35% or 40% of fat. It's pretty high, but if you were eating good sources of fat, let's look at these kind that my cursor is around, you know, the chia seeds and the flax seeds and the pumpkin seeds and the avocado, the salmon, and your cholesterol and all those things look good. Some people can go a little higher in fat, but a moderate amount is about there. We don't need to go so low typically, but some people go very, very low. So there are many different choices, but what are the best choices for fats? All of these here, the olive oil, the canola blends are known to be really good, meaning you can blend your oils and you can put them in a spray bottle so you're not loose-wristed pouring them on everything, because remember that has a caloric value of 9 calories per gram. So even a tablespoon of olive oil is the same amount as a tablespoon of butter. Avocado is a great source. Nuts are high in fat, but a really nice type of fat. Flaxseed, chia seed, salba seeds, if you've ever heard of those, are wonderful. And a lot of the fish you see here. I love this slide. This shows biochemistry of fats. And what we're seeing here is that fats are basically carbon, kind of long chain carbons with a lot of hydrogen around them. And monounsaturated fat, I find this really interesting, and I hope you do too. They have one double bond. That's what makes them monounsaturated. And it also is what makes them more liquid at room temperature in a sense. And the polyunsaturated have 2 double bonds or more. And if you count the carbons, it's kind of fun and go 1, 2, 3, and there's a double bond. That's what makes it an omega-3 fatty acid. And if you count in the first, and it's at 6, that's what's called an omega-6 fatty acid. And I'm going to come back to the biochemistry of fats because it gets really important when we start talking about trans fats. So remember that a saturated fat, what is it saturated with? It's a long carbon chain saturated with hydrogen, right? And that happens naturally in nature. It's kind of interesting. We'll come right back to that point. So fat, again, the best types, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated. And it was once thought, omega-6 and omega-3 are the best. And we just looked, oh, those are polyunsaturated. But everybody usually has heard, I need to get my omega-3 fatty acids. And not many people have heard, I need to get more omega-6 fatty acids. And you'll see omega-6 fatty acids are more in, mayonnaise and sesame oil and such. And the monounsaturated will be more in the olive oil, etc. And we say these are the best. And there's a ratio of omega-3 to omega-6. And it turns out most people are getting way too many omega-6 to omega-3, like 20 to 1. And the ratio maybe should be more like 3 or 4 to 1. And so that's why we're trying to increase those, because they work as vasodilators. They help keep our arteries sort of flowing and clear in that sense. So we want more of these omega-3 in our diets. And not so good are the trans fats. Not only not so good, they're terrible. Trans fats are terrible. I think I show why on the next slide. So I'll wait for that. And saturated fats aren't thought of to be so great by most people. And we're told, oh, it's okay to eat them in moderation, but ideally no more than 7 to 10% of your daily calories would come from saturated fat, because that can wreak havoc on your cardiovascular health, your arteries, and lead to calcification in some cases. So often if somebody has high cholesterol, we're looking at lowering saturated fat. I guess I didn't have a picture of that, so maybe I'll mention that a little. Why trans fats are bad: they decrease total cholesterol, they decrease your LDL. They decrease your HDL, which is the good cholesterol. They increase, did I say that right? They increase your total cholesterol, they increase your LDL, the bad cholesterol, but they decrease the good cholesterol, the HDL. So they're sort of bad on both ends. They wreak havoc on the system, and we're told don't eat any of these if possible. And so we read labels for that.
So you said which one increase the saturated fat?
Saturated fat actually increases. I thought I had a slide on this. I guess I didn't put a slide on this in it, so I'll just say it.
Okay.
So monounsaturated and the polyunsaturated, some of these can actually work to lower the LDL somewhat, or the total cholesterol, but it's the saturated fat that can increase the total cholesterol.
Okay.
But it's the trans fats that not only increase the total cholesterol, increase the LDL, but they also decrease the HDL.
Okay.
A little known fact is that if you ate a lot of saturated fat, it can also increase your HDL, which is good cholesterol.
Okay.
That's kind of positive, but it's also going to be doing things that aren't so good, which is increasing your total cholesterol, increasing your triglycerides and such. So these are not things that we're looking to achieve. And so when you look at this, I find this so fascinating, because what you hear from people is that we need to eat monounsaturated fat. And we think, oh, olive oil is a monounsaturated fat and butter is a saturated fat. But what this is showing us is that nothing is isolated in nature. And that, here we are, just like we said, legumes have a little carbohydrate and some protein. It's not just one thing or the other. I would say butter is a good source of saturated fat. It also has some of the monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats, right? And the same thing, we say olive oil is a great source of monounsaturated fat, but it also has some saturated fat. And to me, what this means is it reminds us not to go so crazy, not to say, oh, if a little bit is good, if some nuts are good for me, I might as well have more nuts. If olive oil is good for me, I might as well pour it over everything I eat. We want to be a little careful and say, well, it's a good source of that, monounsaturated fat, and we know that's really good, but we don't want to overdo it. So the sort of key message here is moderation. And usually at this point, people say, what about avocado oil, or what about this kind? And there's other charts that show you that. And, you know, we could also at some point talk about, I mean, it's important to think about with oils, the smoking point of an oil. So for example, avocado oil is one that a lot of people I've noticed seem to be preferring these days. And I think one of the reasons it has more popularity is it is higher in the, you know, healthier fats, and it also has a higher smoking point.
So this is the question that we get a lot. I think Neeta can also add that which oil should we use for cooking, and especially for Indian cooking. They always ask this question.
There's more and more research. I think that it's perfectly great and good to blend oils. There's not so much known, like if we let's look at coconut oil, because this comes up a lot too, right?
Yes.
That, well, we've heard coconut oil is good. And in fact, it has something, I think it's called lauric acid, which is only found in breast milk. And we know that's really good for us. And it's found also in coconut oil. But we also know that coconut oil, wow, look at that. It's so high in saturated fat.
Yeah.
And so that's a little shocking. And these are very controversial area, because some people will say, I only cook with it. And some people will say, be careful. I say it's a little controversial, and I err on the side of caution. Meaning, and I also think, you know, India is a tropical country. Haven't really heard this argued much, but we all know that it's liquid at room temperature. And if you're cooking with it here, unless it's the hot of the summer, it's solid.
It is solid,
that's sort
yes.
of a clue that in this temperature and climate, you know, and so many things are unknown as far as, you know, if somebody's genetics, if somebody's grown up on some of these things, if they do better. But I'm really careful with something like coconut oil.
Yes.
Not as much coconut, but if I'm thinking of what oil is best to cook with, you know, I like the ones that are higher, you know, like the olive oil, or blending an olive and a sesame oil, or any that you prefer. Some people like the canola oil, or any. I don't think you're going to go wrong as long as you stay in that the moderation of, like, don't cook with a lot of it. I just wouldn't cook with a lot of it. And I usually don't highly recommend, like, you know what, never cook with peanut oil. I think if you're keeping in this amount, I mean, I know when I was in Maharashtra, that was the oil that was always used. And I think there's reasons for the flavor and, you know, different things where we're at. And you could see it's decent in a way. I mean, if you weren't eating a lot, but it's also high in the others. So I think as long as we're staying like kind of under 1 or 2 teaspoons, there's a variety of what could work. I sometimes encourage people to use sprays and you know, again, see what they're comfortable with.
So right now, I mean, we say olive oil, which can be used for seasoning, I mean, which can be used for cooking, and avocado oil if they need to use for the
I think those are great recommendations, Shubha. You know, and there's been more obviously studied on olive oil because of the Mediterranean diet. So if you're going with science, we know a lot about olive oil and, you know, recommending it. We don't know as much about, say, avocado, but I think any of these, again, are fairly safe choices as long as they're in moderation in that sense.
Another question is, isn't it one of the other things to look at is how they are processed to make oil, like canola oil, if it is just with used without chemicals and it's just pressed canola into oil, that is better than you using chemicals to express the oil from some of these.
Absolutely, very important to think about all of the food processing with so many things that we don't think about. And the same, you know, there's virgin olive oil and there's extra virgin olive oil. And I think it's a really good idea to be aware of and to choose, you know, the most unprocessed in this.
And why wouldn't you recommend a lot more flaxseed oil, since it has a lot of omega-3, which
flaxseed oil is great.
Does it last?
Flaxseed oil you have to keep in the refrigerator, right?
Okay.
or it will go
Okay.
rancid, and it's not something that you
That
will
you can-
cook with or that can handle the heat. And so that's
Got
why.
it. Got it.
Yeah.
Got it.
But
So it
most
can be
people,
used like a salad oil.
okay, very nice.
Okay.
Keep it in your refrigerator and put a little bit on your salad. Again, don't go so crazy. People go crazy on these things. They say it's flaxseed oil. I'm going to have, 2 tablespoons a day. I think be a little careful, but it's great. So that's a perfect way to use it if you use it on your salad.
Got it. Okay.
Okay.
We're here talking about trans fats. I find it really interesting. Did you know that the manufacturers are allowed to say no trans fats, even if there are trans fats in something? Yeah, and that's what's so interesting. How do we know something's a trans fat? Remember the biochemical structure. What they do is they partially hydrogenate it. They add hydrogens to a polyunsaturated fat, like soybean oil. Polyunsaturated, more predominantly fat. They hydrogenate it. So they say partially hydrogenated soybean oil. So we know that that is trans fats. And then they advertise no trans fatty acids. And this is for one of
Wow.
those butter substitute spreads that they're allowed to say it lowers your LDL and cholesterol. Now, this is really tricky. Why are they allowed to say that, even though it has all this garbage in it?
Yeah.
Potassium sorbate, artificial flavor, etc. It has
Wow.
some plant sterols, and plant sterols by science are known to reduce LDL and cholesterol. And they come naturally in certain foods. And so they've actually put that in. It's a very deceptive.
Yes.
Very deceptive. It's one of my favorite examples.
Mm.
Another is Girl Scout cookies, because we all love them if we've ever tried Thin Mints. They say trans fats 0 grams, but you've got to get out your magnifying glass and see, oh, wow, it does have partially hydrogenated vegetable oil. That's actually, they say soybean, cottonseed, palm, or palm oils. It's like, we don't even know, and all this other junk.
Yes.
But basically, it's really good to be aware that has trans fats in it, even though they're allowed. Why are they allowed to say that? There's a little loophole in the law that says if something has less than 0.5 grams, it's pretty insignificant. So we'll call it 0. And so the manufacturers get away with it by labeling a serving. They say the serving is 4 cookies. Anybody who's eating 4 cookies can probably be getting up to 0.5 grams. And if they ate 8 or 12 of these things, which is easy to do, you can easily be getting a couple grams of trans fats, which can really wreak havoc on your system. And then we go back into reading labels, which we did last week. And you were all good at this, remembering the reference point, but also remembering, like, here's a picture of a cake. And often you'll look at the label and it will say, like, okay, here's your serving size, here's the calories, here's the sugar, but the cake is all done. But they're just talking about the cake, the cake in the powder in the box that you make into the cake. And it's a reminder to say, they often show things that you have to think in your head, okay, add the other pieces that are not in here. It's like if you go to a restaurant and you order salad, they won't always include the dressing in the description of what's in it. About sugar, no more than 10% of our total calories should come from added sugar. That's a lot, 10%. We should have less than that. American Heart Association says keep it down to 6 to 9 teaspoons per day. And again, just to understand that, like a soda, a typical soda, Coca-Cola, something like that, has 40 grams of sugar typically. That would be like 10 teaspoons. And many things that we eat, this is a really good place to look at how much added sugar is in it. Labels are now supposed to distinguish, starting this year and next, natural and added sugar. That's important because other sugar sources or carbohydrates break down to sugar, right?
Yes.
And so if you're drinking lactose, any dairy, if it's a grain, if it's just fruit, just from plain fruit, in the label, it may appear as sugar, but now they're going to need to separate, and some of them already do. So be looking for that if it's added sugar, or understand to read the ingredients and figure out if the sugar, right, comes towards the beginning of the ingredients, there's a lot more sugar in it than if it's towards the end. This is a great conversation too. We usually end the class talking about what's the difference between a treat and a snack? And as you know, again, as coaches, this is often comes up as often, I think, as people saying, well, what kind of oil? It's like, what do I do about snacking? And I think snacks have become very glamorized. And when we think of snacking, I really think most people think about, some people think about just sort of a pick-me-up, you know, at 4 p.m., I'd say they're going to be a special sweet coffee from Starbucks. Maybe it's going to be some chips. Maybe it's going to be some, you know, that skinny popcorn or sweets or something like that, you know, I mean, just something. And a really beautiful way to think about it is that a snack is just a bridge between a meal. And it typically contains combination of like a vegetable and a protein, or a carbohydrate and a protein. They're not so glamorous. Maybe it's an apple and a handful of nuts. Maybe it's some berries. Maybe it's a yogurt with some berries and a little bit of nut butter or flaxseed. So not that glamorous, but it will satisfy you. So our recommendation here is it's fine to snack daily and treat occasionally. It's fine to have treats, but ask yourself before you have something, is it a snack or a treat? And if you find yourself saying, it's a treat, it's a treat, it's a treat, you know, every day a few times, you may become aware that, oh, I'm treating myself a lot, and maybe I can look for sort of more simple snacks. They don't have to be so glamorous. We often go into, as a class, you know, here was somebody's recipe for Moong sprouts, a wonderful snack or addition to any meal. What is so wonderful about sprouting?
It releases the protein.
The protein content goes up, the nutrients go up, really great nutrients and vitamins. Carbohydrate content even goes down. I mean, the sprouting is just such a great thing to do. It has so many benefits. So this was somebody, actually a picture from somebody, I think, in the class, if I'm remembering. And we usually go through a few go-to meals, and the recommendation for this week is to plan either breakfast, lunch, dinner, or snack. But what's your trickiest meal? What's the one that you say, that's tough for me? Let's start planning 2 or 3 meals that are just quick, go-to, easy snack, and starting to figure out how to get that ready. And maybe it'll be that one. And on our website, we also have ideas from other participants in the class, and we encourage you to give your ideas. And then we just do the typical wrap up. Next week, we get into physical activity. It's going to be fun. Do you know who Penn Jillette is? He's a magician. So Penn Jillette lost over 100 pounds. And he has this great quote that I think is so beautiful. He said, when you're feeling as bad as I felt, and you go to feeling as good as I feel, the temptation to go back to doing what you were doing when you felt bad is not very great. That's what this class is about, or this program, or, you know, is just, you know, we think, how am I going to sustain this? And it's so difficult to make these changes. But in the end, as we feel better and better, the temptation to go back that way is not so big. And then I usually say, all right, so I'm going to quit recording and hope to see you all in class soon.